The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in September, carried by the mail wagon that only reached the remote Colorado ranch once a month. Elizabeth Hayes recognized the handwriting immediately, her sister Mary's careful script, slightly smudged from the long journey from Kansas. But as she read the contents, her hands began to tremble. She had to sit down on the porch step to keep from falling. Dearest Lizzie, I pray this letter finds you well. I have news that I'm afraid will bring you great sorrow. Thomas was killed 3 weeks ago in a mining accident. The cave-in happened so quickly that no one could be saved. I know how much you loved him, and I'm so sorry to be the one to tell you. There's more, sister. Thomas had spoken to several people about you, about how he planned to return to Colorado to marry you as soon as he had saved enough money from the mines. People here knew about his intentions. I thought you should know that his love for you was no secret. Please write soon. I worry about you alone on that ranch, your loving sister. Mary Elizabeth pressed the letter to her chest, her eyes burning with tears she'd been holding back for months. Thomas Brennan had left for the Kansas silver mines in the spring, promising to return by autumn with enough money to buy the neighboring plot of land and expand her small ranch. They'd planned to marry in October, to build a life together in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. But Thomas wasn't coming back. Ever. What? Mary didn't know what Elizabeth couldn't bring herself to write in return was that Thomas had left her with more than just promises and broken dreams. She placed her free hand on her still flat belly, where their child was growing, conceived during their last passionate night together before he'd ridden away toward an uncertain future. At 24, Elizabeth was now a pregnant woman with no husband, no family nearby, and a ranch that was barely keeping her afloat. The scandal alone would be enough to destroy her reputation in their small mountain community. But the practical realities were even worse. How could she manage the cattle, maintain the buildings, and care for a baby all by herself? She was still sitting on the porch, lost in her grief and fear, when she heard the thunder of hoofbeats approaching. Elizabeth quickly wiped her eyes and stood, smoothing her dress and trying to compose herself as a rider appeared over the rise. It was Nathan Pierce, her nearest neighbor, and the most successful rancher in the valley. Even in her distressed state, Elizabeth couldn't help but notice how he sat his horse with natural grace, his broad shoulders outlined against the brilliant autumn sky. Nathan was a man who drew attention wherever he went, tall and strong, with dark hair that always seemed slightly mussed by the wind and eyes the color of stormy skies. He'd been kind to her since her parents had died 2 years ago, offering help with the heavier work around her ranch and always treating her with respectful courtesy. But Elizabeth had been promised to Thomas, and Nathan had never been anything more than a good neighbor. "Morning, Elizabeth," Nathan called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the slight drawl he'd brought with him from Texas years ago. "I was riding the fence line and thought I'd check on you. Everything all right?" Elizabeth clutched Mary's letter tighter, hoping Nathan couldn't see the tear stains on her cheeks. "Everything's fine, thank you." But Nathan had sharp eyes and a gentle heart. He studied her face with growing concern, taking in the pallor of her skin and the way she held herself, as if she were trying not to break apart. "Elizabeth, you look like you've seen a ghost."
What's happened?
The kindness in his voice was her undoing. Elizabeth felt fresh tears spring to her eyes, and she looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I received some difficult news, that's all." Nathan stepped closer, his expression full of quiet sympathy. "About Thomas?" Elizabeth nodded, not trusting her voice. "I'm sorry," Nathan said simply, and the genuine sorrow in his tone told her that he meant it. "I know you cared for him deeply." "He's dead," Elizabeth whispered, the words feeling strange and final on her lips. "Mining accident, he's never coming home." Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and when Elizabeth finally looked up at him, she saw something complicated flickering in his storm-gray eye. Sympathy. Yes, but something else she couldn't quite identify. "I'm truly sorry for your loss," he said carefully. "Thomas was a good man, and he was lucky to have your love." Elizabeth almost laughed at the bitter irony. Lucky? If Thomas had been lucky, He wouldn't be buried in a Kansas grave, and she wouldn't be facing the prospect of burying his child alone and unmarried. "Elizabeth," Nathan said gently, "I hope. You know that if you need anything help with the ranch, supplies, anything at all, you only have to ask." The offer was generous, and Elizabeth knew it came from genuine caring. But how could she explain that what she needed was far more complicated than fence mending or cattle driving? How could she tell this respectable man that she was carrying another man's child and facing social ruin? "Thank you," she managed. "That's very kind." Nathan lingered for a moment longer, as if he wanted to say something more, but finally he tipped his hat and mounted his horse. "Take care of yourself, Elizabeth. Don't be a stranger." As she watched him ride away, Elizabeth felt the weight of her isolation settle around her like a heavy cloak. Nathan Pierce was a good man, the best man she knew. If she were being honest, but even his kindness couldn't solve the impossible situation she found herself in. Over the next few weeks, as autumn deepened into the bright gold and crimson that made the Colorado mountains look like they were on fire, Elizabeth tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. She tended her small herd of cattle, repaired what she could around the ranch, and wrote cheerful letters to her sister that carefully avoided mentioning her. Growing desperation, but the pregnancy was becoming harder to hide. Her dresses were growing tight around the waist, and morning sickness left her weak and shaky when she should have been doing the heavy work that kept her ranch running. Worse, the other ranchers' wives had begun to look at her with speculation and whispered conversations that died abruptly when she approached. It was during one of these difficult mornings, as Elizabeth struggled to lift a bag of feed for her horses while fighting waves of nausea, that Nathan appeared again. This time, he didn't wait for an invitation. He simply dismounted, took the heavy bag from her hands, and carried it to the barn without comment. "You shouldn't be lifting things like that," he said as he emerged from the barn, his expression concerned. Elizabeth felt heat flood her cheeks. How much did he know? How much had he guessed? "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own ranch," she said, trying to sound firm despite the way her voice shook. Nathan studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes taking in details she desperately wanted to hide: the loose fit of her dress, the careful way she moved, the exhaustion that seemed to weigh down her every gesture. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The words sent ice through her veins. "About what?" "About the fact that you're carrying Thomas Brennan's child." Elizabeth's world seemed to tilt sideways. She grabbed the fence post for support, staring at Nathan with wide, frightened eyes. "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do." Nathan's voice was gentle but firm. "I've been watching you struggle for weeks now, trying to figure out how to help without overstepping. But Elizabeth, you can't keep hiding this. People are starting to talk." The confirmation of her worst fears hit Elizabeth like a physical blow. If Nathan had figured it out, others would too. Soon the whispers would become open accusations, and she would be completely ruined. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. Nathan was quiet for so long that Elizabeth wondered if he'd heard her. When he finally spoke, his words were the last thing she'd expected. "I want to marry you." Elizabeth stared at him in shock. "What?" "Your child will need a father," Nathan said simply, "and I want a family." The proposal hung in the air between them like something too fragile to touch. Felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to process what he was offering. "Nathan, you can't possibly." "I've loved you for 2 years," he interrupted, his voice steady and sure. "Since the day you stood up to Jake Morrison when he tried to cheat your father on that cattle deal. Since the morning I found you crying in the pasture after your parents died and you let me hold you while you grieved. I've loved you through your engagement to Thomas, through his departure, through these weeks of watching you carry his child." Elizabeth felt tears streaming down her face. "You can't mean that." "I mean every word." Nathan stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her face. "I know you don't love me the way you loved Thomas. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to let me take care of you and your baby, to give us both a chance at the family we want. The scandal there? Won't be any scandal if we marry quickly. People will assume the child is mine, born a bit early. It happens all the time." Nathan's voice grew softer. "Elizabeth, I'm not offering charity. I'm offering love, partnership, a real marriage if you'll have it. Elizabeth looked into his storm-gray eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and hope. Man, this good, kind, honorable man was offering to sacrifice his own reputation, his chance at a woman who could love him wholeheartedly, for her sake and the sake of a child that wasn't his. "Why?" she whispered. Nathan reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and gently cupped her face in his hands. "'Cause some—" "Yes," she whispered, opening her eyes to meet his gaze. "Yes, I'll marry you." The relief that flooded Nathan's face was almost painful to see. He pulled her gently into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass, and Elizabeth felt something inside her chest, something that had been clenched tight with fear and desperation finally begin to relax. They were married 3 days later in the small church at the center of their valley community, with only the preacher and his wife as witnesses. Elizabeth wore her mother's ivory dress, carefully altered to accommodate her changing figure, and Nathan wore his best suit with a white rose in his lapel. The ceremony was simple and quiet, but as they exchanged vows, Elizabeth found herself meaning the words more than she'd expected. She promised to honor Nathan, to care for him, to be a faithful partner in the life they were building together. And when he promised to love and protect both her and the child she carried, his voice was thick with emotion that brought tears to her eyes. The kiss they shared after being pronounced husband and wife was gentle and brief, but it carried the weight of possibility, the hope that what they were beginning could grow into something real and lasting. Nathan had prepared a small cabin on his ranch for them to live in, while a larger house was being built. As he carried Elizabeth across the threshold, she marveled at the care he'd taken in making it ready for her. There were wildflowers in a jar on the kitchen table, quilts that his mother had made adorning the bed, and a rocking chair positioned by the window where she could watch the mountains while the baby grew. "It's beautiful," Elizabeth said, genuinely touched by the thoughtfulness evident in every detail. "I want you to be comfortable here," Nathan replied, setting her down gently. "I want this to feel like home." That first night as husband and wife, Nathan was a perfect gentleman, gave Elizabeth the bedroom, and made himself a bed on the sofa, kissing her forehead goodnight with tender reverence that made her heart ache in ways she couldn't quite understand. Over the following weeks, settled into the rhythm of married life with surprising ease. Nathan continued to run his large ranch while Elizabeth managed their household and the smaller tasks around their cabin. He was patient with her morning sickness, bringing her tea and toast when she couldn't keep anything else down, and gentle with her changing moods as the pregnancy progressed, but it was the small gestures that began to work their way past Elizabeth's defenses. The way Nathan would read aloud to her in the evenings, his deep voice soothing in the lamplight. How he never failed to compliment the meals she prepared, even when her distracted state led to burned biscuits or oversalted stew. The morning she woke to find that he'd carved a set of wooden toys for the baby, his big hands delicate and sure as he worked. "You don't have to do all this," Elizabeth said one evening as she watched him mending a tear in one of her dresses, his fingers surprisingly nimble with needle and thread. Nathan looked up from his work, his gray eyes soft in the firelight. "Do what?" "Take care of me like this. Be so... ... She struggled for the right word. "So kind. Elizabeth, you're my wife. Taking care of you isn't a burden, it's a privilege." The sincerity in his voice made Elizabeth's throat tight with unexpected emotion. When was the last time anyone had looked at caring for her as a privilege rather than an obligation? As winter settled over the valley, blanketing their world in pristine snow and forcing them to spend long hours together in their cozy cabin, Elizabeth found herself studying her husband with new eyes. Nathan was nothing like Thomas had been where. Thomas had been impulsive and passionate. Nathan was steady and thoughtful. Where Thomas had talked of grand adventures and future dreams, Nathan focused on the present, on making their daily life together as comfortable and happy as possible. It wasn't that she loved him less, it was that she was beginning to love him differently. The realization came to her one snowy evening in December as she watched Nathan building up the fire. His movements efficient and sure. The baby had been particularly active that day, and Elizabeth had been uncomfortable and irritable. But Nathan had simply taken over the household tasks without complaint, preparing dinner and cleaning up afterward while she rested in the rocking chair. Now, the flames caught and warmth began to fill the room. Nathan turned to her with a smile that was purely content, a man, happy to be exactly where he was, doing exactly what he was doing. "Feeling better?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her. "Much, thank you." Elizabeth hesitated, then placed her hand over the spot where the baby was kicking. Would you like to feel?" Nathan's eyes went wide with wonder and something that looked like joy. "Are you sure?" Elizabeth nodded, taking his hand and placing it gently on her rounded belly. They sat in silence for a moment, and then the baby kicked strongly enough that Nathan could feel it. His face lit up with such pure delight that Elizabeth felt her heart skip. "That's incredible," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. "Eyes. So strong." "She," Elizabeth corrected with a smile. "Might be a girl." "She," Nathan agreed, his hand still resting protectively on her belly. "Will be beautiful and stubborn just like her mother." The casual way he claimed the child, the easy possessiveness in his voice made Elizabeth realize something that took her breath away. Somewhere along the way, without her quite noticing, Nathan had stopped being the kind stranger who'd rescued her and had become something far more precious. He'd become home. "Nathan," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He looked up at her, his expression attentive and patient. "I've been thinking about Thomas lately," she began, and saw Nathan's face carefully go blank. "Not the way I used to, not with grief and longing. I've been thinking about the difference between the love I had with him and what I feel now." Nathan was very still. "And what do you feel now?" Elizabeth took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I love Thomas like a wildfire, bright and consuming and dangerous. It burned so hot that it couldn't last, even if he hadn't died. I feel for you, ... double quotes. She paused, searching for the right words. It's like the warmth from this fireplace. Steady, reliable, something I can count on to keep me safe through the coldest nights." Nathan's hand tightened slightly on her belly. "Elizabeth, ... I'm trying to say that I love you," she said in a rush. "Not the way I loved Thomas, but maybe in a better way, a way that will last." The kiss he gave her then was nothing like the chaste pecks they'd shared since their wedding. This was deep and passionate and full of months of careful restraint finally released. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. "I've been waiting so long to hear you say that," Nathan whispered against her forehead. "I've been afraid to." "Feel it," Elizabeth admitted. "Afraid it was just gratitude or convenience, or it's not," Nathan interrupted firmly. "What's between us is real, Elizabeth. It's been building since the day we said our vows, maybe since long before that. That night, for the first time since their marriage, they shared the big bed Nathan had built for them. They made love with a tenderness that brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. Nathan's hands reverent on her changing body, his whispered words of love and devotion, a balm to her soul. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the warm darkness, Elizabeth felt a peace she hadn't known she was capable of feeling. This man had married her when she was broken and desperate, had claimed another man's child as his own, had loved her patiently and completely until she was whole enough to love him in return. "Thank you," she whispered into the quiet night. "For what?" Nathan's voice was drowsy and content. "For seeing something worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." Nathan pulled her closer, his hand settling protectively over their unborn child. "You saved me too, you know. I was getting mighty lonely in this big valley all by myself." Spring arrived early that year, painting the mountains in shades of green and gold that seemed to mirror the hope blooming in Elizabeth's heart. Her pregnancy was progressing well, and the baby was due to arrive in early summer. She and Nathan had settled so completely into married life that Elizabeth sometimes forgot their union had begun as a practical arrangement rather than a love match. The larger house Nathan had been building was nearly finished, the beautiful two-story structure with big windows that looked out over the valley and a nursery painted in soft yellows and greens. Elizabeth spent hours in that room. Folding tiny clothes and arranging the wooden toys, Nathan continued to carve, imagining the child who would soon fill their home with laughter and chaos. It was during one of these peaceful afternoons, as Elizabeth sat in the nursery, organizing baby clothes, that she heard the sound of an unfamiliar horse approaching their cabin. Nathan was out checking the cattle, so she went to the window to see who their visitor might be. Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Thomas Brennan sat astride a dusty horse in their front yard, very much alive and looking around with confusion and growing anger. Elizabeth's hands flew to her throat, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might wake the baby. This was impossible. Thomas was dead. Mary's letter had been very clear. There had been a mining accident, a cave-in, no survivors. But the man dismounting from the horse was undeniably Thomas Older, thinner with new lines around his eyes and a hardness to his face that hadn't been there when he'd left for Kansas. He was alive, and he was here. Elizabeth's carefully rebuilt world was about to shatter into pieces. Thomas's voice carried clearly through the spring air as he called out Elizabeth. "I know you're in there. We need to talk." Elizabeth pressed herself against the nursery wall, her mind racing. She had to think, had to figure out what to do. Nathan would be back soon, and when he saw Thomas, when he realized that Elizabeth's supposedly dead first love was very much alive, what would happen to their marriage, their happiness, their future? "Elizabeth?" Thomas called again, his voice sharper now. "I've ridden 2 days to get here. I'm not leaving until we talk." Taking a deep breath, Elizabeth made her way downstairs and opened the front door. Thomas's eyes immediately dropped to her obviously pregnant belly. His face went through a series of emotions: shock, anger, and something that might have been hurt. "Well," he said grimly, "I can see I arrived just in time." "Thomas," Elizabeth said, her voice barely above a whisper, "you're supposed to be dead." "Reports of my death were greatly exaggerated," Thomas replied with bitter humor. "I was trapped in the mine for 3 days, presumed dead with the others. By the time they dug me out, the whole town thought I was a ghost." As they fixed on her belly, "Seems like you didn't waste much time mourning me." "I thought you were dead," Elizabeth repeated, the words sounding hollow, even to her own ears. "Mary wrote to me, told me about the accident, and you immediately found consolation in someone else's arms." Thomas's voice was harsh with betrayal and jealousy. "Whose child are you carrying, Elizabeth?" The question hit her like a slap. Elizabeth stared at the man she had once planned to marry, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Thomas had always been quick to anger, prone to jealousy, but the hardship he'd endured seemed to have sharpened these traits into something uglier. "It's your child," she said quietly. Thomas went very still. "What did you say?" "The baby is yours, Thomas." "From our last night together before you left for Kansas?" The anger in Thomas's face flickered and changed, replaced by something more complicated. "Mine, yes." Thomas stepped closer, his eyes intense and searching. "Then you haven't betrayed me after all. You've been carrying my child all this time, waiting for me to return." Elizabeth felt a chill of dread at the assumption in his voice. "Thomas, I need to tell you." "No need to explain," Thomas interrupted, reaching for her hands. "I understand everything now. You thought I was dead. You were alone and pregnant. You probably married some local rancher for protection. Well, I'm here now, and I'm alive, and we can fix all of this." "Fix what?" Elizabeth asked, though she was afraid she already knew. "Marriage to whoever this man is. It's not valid now that I've returned. We'll have it annulled, and then we'll marry properly. The child will have his real father's name, and we'll build the life we planned before I left." Elizabeth pulled her hands free from his grasp, taking a step back. "Thomas, you don't understand. You can't just what?" Thomas's voice was rising, the old familiar edge of possessiveness creeping in. "Can't leave a marriage of convenience to be with the man you actually love? The father of your child? The man I love is my husband," Elizabeth said firmly. Thomas stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What?" "I love Nathan Pierce. He's been my husband for 6 months, and he's going to be this baby's father in every way that matters." Nathan Pierce. Thomas's face darkened with fury. "That Texas rancher who's been sniffing around you for years? You married him? He offered to take care of us when I had nowhere else to turn," Elizabeth said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And somewhere along the way, I fell in love with him. Thomas's hand shot out and grabbed her wrist, his grip tight enough to bruise. You fell in love with him while you were carrying my child? Let go of me, Elizabeth said sharply, but Thomas's grip only tightened. I've been working in hell for 8 months, dreaming of coming back to you, and I find out you've been playing house with another man. Thomas, you're hurting me? I'm hurting you? Thomas's laugh was bitter and ugly. Do you think I feel? Finding out that the woman I love, the woman who promised to wait for me, has been warming another man's bed? I thought you were dead, Elizabeth cried, trying to pull free from his grasp. I grieved for you, I mourned you, and then I had to face the reality of being pregnant and alone. Nathan saved us both. Nathan, Thomas spat. You say his name like he's some kind of hero? He took advantage of your situation, Elizabeth. He swooped in when you were vulnerable and claimed what was mine. I'm not property to be claimed, Elizabeth shot back, anger finally overriding her fear. I'm a woman who made a choice, the best choice I could make for myself and my child. Thomas's face was twisted with rage and jealousy. And what about me? Don't I deserve a say in what happens to my child? Where were you when I was sick every morning for months? Where were you when I was so scared and alone that I could barely function? Where were you when your child was growing inside me and I had no idea how I would survive? I was trapped in a mine, Thomas shouted. I was fighting for my life. And I was fighting for mine and the babies, Elizabeth replied. I'm not going to apologize for the choices I made to survive. Thomas released her wrist so suddenly that she stumbled backward. For a moment, they stared at each other across a chasm that seemed impossibly wide, all the love they'd shared. All the plans they'd made, rendered meaningless by time and circumstance, and the different people they'd become. So that's it? Asked, his voice hollow. You're choosing him over me, or the father of your child? I'm choosing the man who was here when I needed him, Elizabeth said softly. The man who married me when I had nothing to offer but scandal and hardship. The man who loves me enough to claim another man's child as his own. And what about love? Thomas demanded. We had something real, Elizabeth, something passionate and true. Elizabeth looked at this man she had once thought she'd spend her life with, and felt only sadness for what they'd lost. What we had was beautiful, Thomas. But it was also young and untested. What Nathan and I have built together that's real too. It's maybe more real because it's survived hardship and sacrifice. You've changed, Thomas said accusingly. Elizabeth agreed. I have. Grief and responsibility and love have changed me. I'm not the same girl who kissed you goodbye last spring. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their confrontation. Nathan was returning from the range, and Elizabeth felt a mixture of relief and terror as she saw him crest the hill. How would he react to finding Thomas here? What would he do when he learned that Elizabeth's supposedly dead first love had returned to claim his child? Nathan must have sensed trouble immediately, because he spurred his horse into a gallop as soon as he saw the strange rider in their yard. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his eyes taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a man accustomed to danger. Elizabeth, he said, moving to her side with protective instincts that made her heart ache with love. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said, though the tremor in her voice belied her words. Nathan's gaze shifted to Thomas, and Elizabeth saw recognition dawn in his storm-gray eyes. Thomas Brennan, I presume? Pierce, Thomas acknowledged with barely concealed hostility. I've come to collect what's mine. Nathan's arm came around Elizabeth's waist, gentle but unmistakably possessive. And what would that be, my child? Thomas said bluntly. And the woman I was going to marry. The woman you were going to marry is now my wife, Nathan replied calmly, though Elizabeth could feel the tension in his body. And the child she's carrying will be my son or daughter. That baby is mine by blood, Thomas snarled. You can't just steal a man's family and expect him to walk away. I didn't steal anything, Nathan said, his voice still level but carrying an edge of steel. I married a woman who needed protection, and I claimed a child who needed a father. You were dead, Brennan. At least that's what we were told. Well, I'm alive now, Thomas shot back, and I want my family back. Elizabeth felt the weight of both men's expectations pressing down on her, but she knew with crystal clarity what her answer had to be. I'm not your family anymore, Thomas. I haven't been since the day I married Nathan. Thomas's face contorted. With pain and rage, Elizabeth, think about what you're saying. This man married you out of pity. This man married me out of love, Elizabeth interrupted firmly. Love that was strong enough to claim another man's child. Love that was patient enough to wait for me to heal. Love that was generous enough to give me everything without asking. For anything in return? I can give you everything too, Thomas said desperately. I struck silver in Kansas real silver, enough to make us rich. We can go anywhere, do anything. I can give you a life of luxury. Elizabeth looked at the man offering her wealth and adventure, then at the man who had offered her safety and steady love. There was no contest. I don't want luxury, she said simply. I want the life Nathan and I have built together. The fight grumbled, the fight going out of him all at once. Elizabeth, please. I've lost everything my partner's in the mine. Years of my life. Don't let me lose you too. Elizabeth felt tears spring to her eyes at the genuine pain in his voice. Thomas, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything you've did. Been through for the grief you must have felt when you learned I'd married someone else. But I can't undo the choices I've made, and I wouldn't want to. Nathan is my husband, my partner, my future. This baby will be his child in every way that matters. And what about me? Thomas asked brokenly. What am I supposed to do now? It was Nathan who answered, his voice surprisingly gentle. You're supposed to build a new life. Find someone who can love you the way you deserve to be loved. Raise this child with the love and stability every baby needs. Thomas looked between them for a long moment, and Elizabeth could see him wrestling with his pain and disappointment. Finally, he nodded slowly. I won't try to take the child from you, he said quietly. But I want to be able to see him sometimes, to know how he's growing up. Elizabeth felt Nathan's arm tighten around her, and she looked up at her husband's face. She could see the struggle there, the desire to protect his family warring with his innate sense of fairness. Letters, Nathan said finally. You can write to us, and we'll write back. Let you know how the child is doing, but visits. He shook his head. It would be too confusing, too painful for everyone. Thomas nodded again, accepting the compromise with more grace than Elizabeth had expected. All right, letters. Mounted his horse and looked down at them one last time, his face etched with sorrow and resignation. Take care of her, he said, to Nathan, and take care of my child. I will, Nathan promised. You have my word. As Thomas rode away, disappearing over the rise that led back to the main road, Elizabeth felt the last chapter of her old life finally close. She leaned into Nathan's solid warmth, grateful beyond words for the man who had claimed her heart and her future. Are you all right? Nathan asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. I am now, Elizabeth replied, meaning it completely. I love you, Nathan Pierce. Not because you rescued me, not because you were convenient, but because you're the best man I've ever known. Nathan's kiss was tender and fierce, full of relief and renewed commitment. When they broke apart, he rested his forehead against hers. For a minute there, I thought I might lose you, he admitted. Never, Elizabeth said firmly. You're stuck with me forever. Their daughter was born on a warm June evening, arriving. With a lusty cry that announced her intention to be heard, Nathan was there for the birth. Holding Elizabeth's hand and whispering words of encouragement, his face streaked with tears of joy when he held his daughter for the first time. They named her Sarah Rosera for Nathan's mother, Rose for Elizabeth's grandmother. She had Elizabeth's dark hair and Thomas's green eyes, but when she wrapped her tiny fingers around Nathan's thumb, there was no question about who her father really was. She's perfect, Nathan whispered, cradling the baby with surprising skill for such a big man. Elizabeth watched her husband with their daughter and felt her heart overflow with love and gratitude. This man had given her everything: love, security, family, a future bright with possibility. He had claimed another man's child as his own, and would love her with the fierce devotion of a true father. Thank you, she said softly. Nathan looked up from the baby, his storm-gray eyes soft with wonder. For what? We seen what we could. Become before I could see it myself, Elizabeth replied. For loving me enough to wait for me to catch up. Elizabeth, Nathan said, settling beside her on the bed with Sarah still in his arms, I want